Our covenant calls us to hold urgent and dear Unitarian Universalism's aspirations to building the beloved community with diversity, inclusion, equity, compassionate justice, and an acknowledgement of our interdependence with other forms of life. We have bound ourselves together in faithful discernment, not just by structure, but in our learning and our living. Our common ministry must lead us forward toward transformation and liberation. We are called to travel this path together, because together we are more. These words from the report Widening the Circle of Concern, written by the Commission on Institutional Change, have stuck with me over the last year, particularly the last sentence. We are called to travel this path together, because together we are more. Together we are more. At last year's UUA General Assembly, when Widening the Circle of Concern was released, there was a workshop that caught my attention in particular. It was on the idea of the congregation as a community of communities, an idea developed by Paula Cole Jones, who was going to make that the subject of her sermon when she was our guest preacher back in January, only there had just been an attempted coup organized by the former president and his toadies, so Jones had to change her sermon. In the GA workshop, which you can watch via the UUA website, Jones explains that many of us tend to think about and talk about our congregation as a family. That's good and understandable in that the family holds a special, for some people even a sacred place in our society. But the idea that a congregation is a family also brings with it unexamined assumptions and emotional baggage, and that can get in the way of building the beloved community. Jones notes that we don't just belong to one thing, one family that is the be-all and end-all of our existence. In practice, we belong to multiple things. Each of us is part of many different communities, depending on our identities and our needs, and that's not only okay, but encouraged when we tell people that they don't need to leave any part of who they are at the door of a UU church. So a congregation that respects individual identities and differing needs can't be a singular monolithic group of people. Rather, as Jones explains, a church is made up of, for example, the people who are part of the music program, and the people who lead religious education classes, and the people who run social justice programs, and the people who take meals to those who need them, and so on. And yes, there's overlap between those groups of people, but not everybody is part of every group in the same way. More importantly, each group is, to varying degrees, its own community too. In short, a church isn't a family with everyone limited to their biological kinship. Instead, it's more realistic and more helpful to think of it as a community made up of all the communities within it, even communities that include people beyond the congregation too. It's about relationship and all of the different ways of relating to one another, to each of the church communities in which we are involved, and to the congregation as a whole. Now, when I heard about this idea of a congregation as a community of communities, I was immediately inspired. For one thing, it brought to mind something that has been called Gilbert's Wheel, a way of thinking about balanced church programming proposed by the Reverend Richard Gilbert, longtime minister and then minister emeritus at First Unitarian in Rochester, New York. In his book on the prophetic imperative of our faith, which explores the connections between spirituality and social action, Gilbert draws a circle representing a congregation with four parts, what he calls the four dimensions of religious life in the church. First, the church as a worshipping or celebrating community out of a spiritual core. Second, the church as a caring community in which a mutual ministry operates to meet personal needs. Third, the church as a learning community of lifespan religious education. And fourth, the church as a prophetic community of moral discourse and social action. The key to this, as Gilbert puts it, is that these are not separate from one another, but overlap in different church programs. They are interdependent. No one part succeeds unless all the others succeed too. They are all integral to congregational life. So I thought to myself, what if, since I'm a visual person, I drew Paula Cole Jones' congregation as a community of communities and used Dick Gilbert's wheel as a way to organize those communities? How would that look for us, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Peninsula? So that's what I tried to draw. And here's my drawing, if you'd put it up on the screen for us, please, Jeff. Okay, so I was aiming for a rough visual interpretation of our congregational life here. You can see this. I did this by hand. This is not aiming at mathematical precision. So I may not have all of these perfectly positioned, and I emphasized ongoing programs rather than committees, for instance. But I think it's helpful in seeing how our various programs fit together and fill out both Jones and Gilbert's ways of understanding the congregation. So the big circle here is the congregation as a community of communities. Then there are four circles, overlapping circles within it: the celebrating community, the caring community, the learning community, and the prophetic community. And then in red are our various ongoing programs, placed roughly where I thought they made sense within Gilbert's framework. So some of these programs, some communities in their own ways very often, fit within one of Gilbert's four dimensions of religious life, such as the forum in learning or hospitality teams in caring. We have some that fit in the overlap of a couple of dimensions, such as book club in learning and caring, or women's drumming in celebrating and caring. And we have some that fit into three or even all four dimensions, such as green sanctuary in prophetic learning and celebrating, or youth group right in the middle of all four. We can also see how the congregation is pretty well represented on the learning and caring side of congregational life, and not so much on the prophetic and celebrating side. In particular, there's not much in the overlap between prophetic and celebrating, and that's something I think we must address. Doing justice work, after all, is draining, not just intellectually and emotionally, but physically too. After Thursday's Newport News school board meeting, when so many people spoke on supposedly religious grounds against protections for transgender students, or repeatedly equated trans people with pedophiles, and even though I didn't get the opportunity to speak, and I was otherwise sitting the whole time, I left exhausted and feeling rather nauseated too. Meeting Gavin Grimm and thanking him for what he did, what unfortunately he had no choice but to do in Gloucester, lifted my spirits somewhat. And knowing that the Newport News School Board ultimately made the right decision helped me feel a bit better before I went to sleep. But it falls far short of what Dr. King called the double victory of not only winning the struggle, but also winning over the hearts and consciences of our opponents. We need ways to keep our spirits up. to encourage us to get back up when we're knocked down, to re-energize us to keep going until we can claim that double victory. It's no accident that social movements of all stripes don't only bring signs to protests and marches, they bring songs too. We need programs that overlap both prophetic and celebrating because they depend on each other. Neither succeeds unless the other succeeds. Thank you, Jeff. You can stop screen sharing now. In her GA workshop, Paula Cole Jones noted 4 points about understanding a congregation as a community of communities. First, the communities are already here. We're already responding to the fact that this is the case, even if we don't realize it. For example, when Alicia Hoffler, as UUFP Vice President, was assembling the Transition Task Force, she didn't have a list of people she'd already decided she wanted on it. Rather, she had a list of constituencies and stakeholder groups to be represented. And then she worked with each of those communities to find somebody to represent them. Second, individuals don't need to be seen as exceptions to the rule in order to belong. Families have rules about who's in and who's not, but a community of communities has a place for everyone. This is particularly pertinent to us as we continue to respond to widening the circle of concern and make a decision regarding the 8th principle. We say we want the UUFP to be a racially and culturally diverse congregation. And that means we need to talk about what it truly means for everyone to belong, rather than merely giving people of color a pass in a white space. Third, the community of communities helps us to understand what it means to be in covenantal, transformative, cooperative relationships rather than contractual, transactional, competitive relationships. After all, a church sees itself as a family. A church that sees itself as a family inevitably organizes itself around individual personalities, whereas a congregation that understands itself as a community of communities organizes itself around its mission. So even though each program and group has its own reason for being, whether that's to read books or practice deep, compassionate listening or serve meals to hungry people or drum together, everyone is otherwise rowing in the same direction. Fourth, all of our values come into play. Jones framed this in terms of the UUA's principles because those apply to all UU congregations. But we can think of this in terms of our UUFP values that are uniquely ours: wonder, love, service, and generosity. And those values have led us, through our mission and the resulting vision, to our search for a new church building, something that has continued through the pandemic and in October enters an exciting new phase with our capital campaign. What drives and guides us in all of it, though, is how we understand our values, not as individuals, but as a congregation, as a community of communities, because together we are more than the sum of our parts. So how can growing in wonder help us heal and strengthen the interdependent web? What can connecting in love do to create a just society? How can engaging in service bring more compassion into human relations? What can inspiring generosity do to build an equitable future for everyone? In next month's services, we'll reflect on these and other questions and discover all of the ways in which, through them, we are saving the world. Our covenant calls us to hold urgent and dear Unitarian Universalism's aspirations to building the beloved community with diversity, inclusion, equity, compassionate justice, and an acknowledgement of our interdependence with other forms of life. We have bound ourselves together in faithful discernment, not just by structure, but in our learning and living. Our common ministry must lead us forward toward transformation and liberation. We are called to travel this path together, because together we are more. Together we are more, because we are more than a family. We are a community of communities. When we tell people that they don't need to leave any part of who they are at the door of our UU Church, we make a promise to respect all of their identities, to listen to all of their needs, and to make a place for them, whether that's celebrating, caring, learning, prophetic, or some combination. For all of us, serving the mission and saving the world are greater together than we are apart. And together we can achieve what we cannot do alone. May it be so.